There we go. Okay, so like Carla mentioned, thank you for the introduction. And today I'm going to speak about my research on blue carbon ecosystem responses to sea level rise, specifically in South Africa. The structure of this presentation is going to follow what is blue carbon, why are blue carbon ecosystems important and vulnerable, a brief overview of sea level rise, how do carbon ecosystems respond to sea level rise, why, how, and where are we measuring these responses in South Africa, a brief intro to the sea level affecting marshes model, which is what we've been using to predict responses to sea level rise, and some preliminary results from our ongoing study at the Swartkops estuary. Okay. So what is blue carbon? Blue carbon is the carbon stored in coastal and marine ecosystems, specifically mangroves, tidal marshes, and seagrasses. In South Africa, these ecosystems are limited to occurring exclusively in estuaries because the coast is high energy with a lot of wave action. So blue carbon ecosystems absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they sequester and store this carbon dioxide in very large quantities, both within the plants and the sediment of the habitat. If left intact, this carbon can be locked up for centuries. So where do blue carbon ecosystems occur? They're distributed globally. And so here we can see on the map that mangroves are mainly limited to tropical and subtropical regions. 83% of the global carbon cycle is circulated through the ocean, and coastal habitats cover less than 2% of the total ocean area. However, 50% of the total carbon sequestered by ocean sediments is captured in these coastal habitats. Therefore, intact blue carbon ecosystems are important because they can sequester and store carbon for centuries. Degrading or destroying blue carbon ecosystems releases this carbon back into the atmosphere. These ecosystems are also important because they provide many other ecosystem services, including water filtration, which improves water quality, nursery areas to important fish that are targeted by fisheries, and also these habitats serve as natural coastal protection to protect the coast from floods and storm surges and sea level rise threats. The Blue Carbon Initiative is a global program that is working to protect and restore coastal ecosystems for their role in mitigating or reducing climate change impacts because they absorb atmospheric carbon dioxide. And this is achieved through two working groups that are focused on science and policy, respectively. So blue carbon ecosystems are vulnerable to sea level rise because of their position within the tidal frame. These habitats are structured and they occur in certain zones that are suitable or preferable for their physiological tolerance of the specific plant species. As sea level rises within a specific zone, the habitat could become unsuitable and the plant species could be replaced by others that previously occurred lower down on the elevation gradient. So over time, there can be a conversion of marsh habitat to mudflat, or even eventually to open water if water levels keep rising. Mangroves and salt marshes occur within the tidal frame, and therefore sea level rise is a significant threat to these ecosystems globally. Changes in inundation frequency can lead to the vegetation to die off and species shifts and reduce productivity. And when there's a loss of vegetation, this can exacerbate erosion, which then further amplifies the effect of rising water levels. So sea level rise is regionally variable, and there are many local scale factors that influence vulnerability. So getting onto sea level rise, well, it's complicated. The most recent report from the IPCC came out last year in September, and this is on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. And I've just taken some figures out from chapter 4, which was on sea level rise implications. So if we look at the schematic diagram, we can see there are many factors and processes that affect sea level across the global, local, and regional scales. And often we're only measuring relative sea level rise, and not considering the effects of all these interacting processes, which is okay, but we need to keep in mind that it is complicated and it's more than just what we are observing. So the current projections by the IPCC now extend up to 2300, but with low confidence, whereas the projections to 2100, they have medium confidence. So here's just the projection of global mean sea level projection up to 2100 under RCP 2.6 and RCP 8.5, where these are the representative concentration pathways. So what these mean is that RCP 2.5 is a low emission scenario, and 8.5 is a very high greenhouse gas emission scenario. So with 8.5, they project a global mean sea level increase of 1 meter. It's important to know that this is variable between regions and locally as well. Okay. So sea level rise is complicated because there are many drivers that influence relative sea level rise, but there's also an additional dimension because the coast is not just physical habitat, it's also home to many people. So I've just pulled out this figure here that shows nicely the interactions between sea level rise, sea level hazards, exposure, vulnerability, and impacts and risks related to sea level rise and responses. I've just blocked out in green the things that we've started looking at as part of our research. In orange, other blocks are things that we're hoping to include soon, or we have the ability to include soon within our research. And the red blocks are areas that need more attention, and hopefully they'll be included in our work going forward. Okay, so how do blue carbon ecosystems fit in? These ecosystems can respond to sea level rise, they are resilient, and they have persisted through previous global sea level rise fluctuations. There are two possible responses to sea level rise, that is surface elevation gain or landward migration. However, these responses depend on several factors that, again, operate across spatial extents and temporal periods. And so responses of these blue carbon habitats to sea level rise also need to be assessed regionally and locally. So in my schematic diagram here, we have the two different responses to sea level rise. With surface elevation gain, as the sea level rises, the habitat maintains relative elevation through accumulation of sediments and organic material over time at a rate that is comparable to the sea level rise. The habitat therefore remains at the same elevation relative to the rising water level. For landward migration, as the sea level rises, the habitat retreats, which happens slowly at the pace or growth of the vegetation regeneration, so that plants can maintain their ideal position within the tidal frame as water level increases. This also needs to happen at a rate that is comparable to the sea level rise. And if there are obstructions that prevent the habitat from migrating, for example, if the slope is too steep, the terrain is unsuitable, or if there are buildings, roads, or walls, then the habitat can be lost. And this is what we call coastal squeeze. So why should we measure responses of blue carbon habitats to sea level rise? Well, we know that there are estimates of sea level rise for the South African coast and that they're variable from 1.87 millimeters per year on the west coast to 1.47 millimeters per year on the south coast and 2.74 millimeters per year on the east coast. Mangroves occur exclusively along the east coast, while salt marshes are distributed around the South African coastline. So we need to know how these habitats are responding. Blue carbon ecosystems are ecologically and economically valuable for the ecosystem services they provide, and they also are important habitats for many species and they support biodiversity. Additionally, these habitats are under multiple other direct and indirect pressures that occur from catchment to coast. So how do we measure the responses of sea level rise? We're currently using the globally standardized method called the rod surface elevation table with an associated marker horizon. And this method has been laid out by the USGS. So here's the air schematic for it. In brief, I'm going to explain how it works. This RSET benchmark is constructed with stainless steel rods that are threaded together and then driven to refusal, which is until it won't go anymore, until you get to the bedrock, and it can extend as far as 40 meters. In our estuaries, most of them are only to around 4 meters deep. Then, so that remains at the site. Every time we come to the field, we bring the RSET instrument with us, and we measure these pins that are on the instrument. The arm is rotated into 8 positions, and we measure the heights of the pin on the arm. In this way, changes in the height of a pin in the height of the pins over time reflect the vertical dynamics of that area. Okay, so I have a video now, and I hope that it works all right. This is just a sped up version of us measuring in the field 2 weeks ago. Okay, funny, we could do it that fast, like in real time. So associated with the RSET is we have what we call the marker horizon. So this is an artificial soil layer which consists of feldspar or white clay is what we've been using, and it's established on the surface and it's used to measure accretion. So we do this by placing it on the surface of the substrate and then returning and taking a core and measuring the depth to this artificial layer. So you can see here on the core that like kind of really faint white mark was the marker horizon, and that was 1 year later that we sampled that core. So in conjunction with the RSET, we use the marker horizon to be able to measure how surface elevation has changed at the site. So where are we measuring responses to sea level rise in South Africa? Through my postdoc and in collaboration with ongoing work with SAON, we now have measuring benchmarks at 5 South African estuaries, 3 that are exclusively in salt marsh, and 2 estuaries where we have salt marsh and mangrove. So I'm just going to walk through each estuary and show you some of the preliminary and some published results that we have so far. So we're going to start with the Knysna estuary, which is in the Western Cape. And this is the distribution of the RSET benchmarks throughout the estuary. Okay. So the Knysna estuary we collected data. There was 3 years of data from 2009 to 2011, and then we revisited in 2018. And what we found is that most sites are relatively stable. So on the left-hand side, this is the surface elevation change in millimeters above mean sea level for each site. On the right-hand side is the surface elevation difference. So this is the difference between the first value taken in 2009 and the last value taken in 2018 divided by 9 to get the year average. So we can see that the sites in the middle reaches had some deficits or remained the same, while in the upper reaches and some sites in the lower reaches had gains. So inconsistency like throughout the estuary. The next estuary is the Crom estuary, which is in the Eastern Cape. Here we have RSETs in the lower reaches and then further up the estuary. And at this estuary and also at Knysna, all of the benchmarks are within the lower intertidal zone within the Spartina maritima habitat. So for the Crom estuary, there are only 3 years of data from 2009 to 2011. So it's a much shorter data set. And here we saw losses in the lower reaches, and some gains in the middle and upper reaches. It's important to note, although there are losses and gains, it's still relatively stable over time. Okay. Next up, we have the Swartkops estuary here in Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape. Here we also have the RSET benchmarks occurring in the Spartana salt marsh, in the lower middle, and then like more middle reaches just beyond the bridge. So the Swartkops estuary has a 10-year data set from 2009 until 2019, and there's a plan to go and measure it still this year. So here we can see it's a better trend if you have more data to work with. Benchmark 4 actually was completely eroded away, and I don't think it was able to be measured on the previous trip. So we can see there has been some change here at some sites, and others have remained relatively stable over time. So this one here is on number 4, is in the middle reaches. And we think it's just because of channel meandering that site has eroded away. Okay, the next estuary is the Nahoon estuary in the Eastern Cape. So you can see from this figure, we have three benchmarks in salt marsh, 3 benchmarks across a mangrove salt marsh ecotone, and 3 benchmarks in the mangrove area. It's a very small habitat, but we're hoping that we can still, get some interesting information out of it. Okay, so this is also a short data set because these benchmarks were only placed at the beginning of my postdoc. So we've only been measuring for 3 years now. So we can see also some increases, some decreases, some remaining the same. And the final estuary is the Nanlo estuary, also in the Eastern Cape. And here we also have them set up with benchmarks 1, 2, and 3 being in the salt marsh, 4, 5, and 6 in the mangrove area, and 7, 8, and 9 on this island that also represents a mangrove salt marsh ecotone. The results for this estuary are a bit different because these benchmarks have not as yet been leveled relative to mean sea level. So these are just the raw data that I have plotted here that kind of show all of the sites are quite stable over time over the last 3 years. All right. So what does all of this actually mean, and can we make any predictions? Well, what it shows us is, if anything, it's that surface elevation change is variable between estuaries and even between sites in the same estuary. And this can be due to sediment dynamics, difference in flows, difference in hydrology, and also differences in the productivity or the plant species in which the benchmark is located. Overall, however, most sites are relatively stable over time with slow increases in elevation. And the next step would be to compare these responses to the local relative sea level rise, which is being measured at the tide gauge. We know that sea level rise for the South African region is lower than the global average, which has been estimated at 3 millimeters per year. So this could explain why there's slow elevation change, because elevation change is only in response to sea level. We can also use predictive modeling to determine the fate of these habitats if sea level rise had to increase, and that's what I'm going to go on to next. So if we want to look at blue carbon ecosystems and future sea level rise, we've been using SLAM, which is the sea level affecting marshes model. It's a spatial simulation. So what that means is that it requires a map of the area of interest and also a detailed elevation model of the area of interest. And it works, it's GIS based. So SLAM simulates inundation, erosion, overwash, saturation, and salinity, which are physical chemical parameters. And we know that these are important because that's what's structuring our salt marsh or mangrove across the tidal frame. So how does SLAM work? Very basically and briefly, if you remember, the first diagram was that as sea level rises, so your salt marsh wants to be in an area that is more suitable or preferable. And so what SLAM does is it incorporates this and also a feedback mechanism. So if there is surface elevation gain, which we're measuring at the RSET, then this should feed back and into the model and show that if the gain is sufficient or high enough, then the habitat will not convert. But if there is a loss in surface elevation at the marsh, then it will convert to a habitat that is lower down on the tidal frame, and it can eventually convert to mud flats or open water. So that's SLAM in a nutshell. Sorry. Okay, so currently the project that I'm working on is focused on applying the SLAM to the Swartkops estuary in the Eastern Cape. And some of the questions that I have are, how will sea level rise impact salt marsh distribution? What is the vulnerability of the developed areas to flooding from sea level rise? Where are the areas that salt marsh will expand to? And can these areas be restored so that carbon storage can be enhanced? And this is the work that is being carried out in collaboration with the Indian Ocean Blue Carbon Hub, and this is CSIRO in Perth, Australia. Okay, so here we have my work in progress. This is a map of the current vegetation distribution in the Swartkops estuary in 2020, and what our preliminary results suggest 2100 will look like under 1 meter of sea level rise. So we can see this like bright pink area is flooded developed dry land, and that suggests there is vulnerability to sea level rise. In the middle to upper reaches, the large bit that is predicted to be flooded is actually currently occupied by salt pan areas, so that could convert to salt marsh over time. Yeah, so we can see also a large expansion of estuarine open water as well as tidal flats in the lower reaches. So I'm hoping to finish this up and submit it soon so that these results will be available and applicable where necessary. Okay, in conclusion, sea level rise is a global threat to coasts, and it's important to know that coasts are ecosystems and people, and it's therefore a complicated issue to deal with. Blue carbon ecosystems can respond to sea level rise, and they can even provide protection against sea level rise. So in South Africa, we've measured responses and we found that they are variable. Mostly we need more long-term data, as trends can really only be considered after more than 3 years of data. This field of research is still emerging, but it is important, and it adds another dimension towards estuary management. So I'd just like to acknowledge the different funding and collaborating organizations without which this kind of work would not be possible. Also to everyone who's helped on the project so far and who spent time out in the mud measuring for me and with me. It's been good so far, and I hope that we can carry on with this kind of work. And yeah, thank you.